Thank you very much. It's such a great pleasure being with all of you this afternoon, and especially with Dr. Cristina Mora. What an incredible last few days. And this topic about Latinidad and who we are and what we represent, it couldn't be more perfect, right? More timing than what is happening in our beautiful country the last few days in during election season. So without further ado, Dr. Moore, I know you've done an incredible research, a lot of work around this topic about Latinidad, especially in your recent book. But what is your take the last few days as we see these elections results in Florida and Arizona across the country? What are you feeling nowadays, and what does it mean from a perspective of Hispanic Latinos that we did such a great support for Trump in Florida, but so different outlook in the rest of the country from Latinos to Trump. So are we the same or we're not the same as a Latino community?
I think all of us that are Latino know that we, have some level that unites us. Mainly, there's most of us have some sort of tie to immigration. There's an immigration story in our family. There's a story of like having come from somewhere else to establish anew and sort of fight our own way to think about what the American dream means for us and for our kids, right? And so there is that immigration story. There is the fact that lots of us live in the same neighborhoods, right? You don't have to look too far to see that Spanish Harlem, for example, became quickly Puerto Rican and Dominican. If you look at LA, it went from Mexican to Mexican and Central American. Houston, right? It became Mexican, Central America, South American. And we live in the same neighborhoods. We share an immigration story and we have a deep history. And most of all, what's important to always keep in mind is that there's a real struggle for adequate representation, right? Look at any number, almost any statistic, and Latinos are underrepresented. Whether you look at how many Latinas are tenured professors, right, in Research One's university, whether you look at Latino doctors, whether you look at Latinos and CEOs, you're not seeing them at the number that we have. So there are many things that keep us in common, and yet by virtue of being Latino, we know that we're also different, right? We know that not everyone likes the tortilla. We know that, or that it means different things in whatever country you're at, right? And so we know these things. And so for us, I think the question of the election story that came out wasn't like, oh my God, this is a big surprise, right? And it's not. If you look at American history, you do know that, about 20 to, anywhere from 22 to 26% of the Latino electorate has always been Republican. And for a variety of reasons, whether part of this was Nixon's, close connections to the Cuban American community in the 1970s, or simply the argument that George Bush was able to sort of come out as sort of this religious conservatism. We know that. We know that this, so what we saw is not radically new. What's different is that the media suddenly started covering us, right? And it was because of who Trump is, and it was because of how important the election was and things like that, that they suddenly zeroed in and were like, oh my God, what's going on here? And it's like this sudden story of like, can Latinos be different, or are all Latinos like this, or things like that, when we have always known that there are vast geographic, political, skin color differences, all kinds of things that make us different amidst, the broader things that we thought of unity, right? And yeah, I tend to think of, there are many political stories that have come out about Latinos, but the biggest story that hasn't come out is just how important our voter turnout was. We've got 2.1, our estimates are 2.1 million more Latinos came out in 2020, the largest number ever. And we came out in really important places. So for example, even the Puerto Rican turnout in Tampa increased significantly. So even if this Florida story is covered about what went on in Miami-Dade, so much happened in Tampa, Milwaukee, Latinos in Milwaukee came out in full force. So when we go back and think about what flipped Wisconsin, we'll be remiss not to think about Latinos. And of course, you can't forget the Arizona story. The Arizona story for me right now is about Latino people power, right? Regardless of how folks voted, right? You can't deny that, neither Trump or Biden spent significant time there. And yet the turnout was massive and perhaps enough to flip a state. And so that's the story, the people power story, the coming out story that I wish the media would cover more so than, a place that only has, a community that represents, around 3% of the entire Latino population. So that's what I'd be looking at.
Absolutely. So let's go right into the discussion about your book, Making Hispanics. So obviously right now, this is a very important time for the Latino community. And it's up to all of us, right, to continue working together against being underrepresented, as you mentioned, as being underheard, underacknowledged, and underappreciated, right? So I like to go and dive into your book, right? This topic about making Hispanic. Can you share what drove you to write this book, and how can you define pan-ethnicity for us and why it's so important, especially in this era?
Yeah, I think what drove me to write this book is twofold. One is a personal story, and one is just a sort of an academic story. And the personal story is, like Pedro, I'm Mexican American, so I grew up thinking, or saying I'm Chicana. When I went to college, I was Chicana/Latina. And then but I grew up in Los Angeles, right? In the east side of Los Angeles, in a neighborhood where really diversity was what part of Mexico your parents came from. Whether it wasn't even like Central Americans in a presence weren't really there, right? So it was like, were they from the north or the south or whatever it was, right? And then I ended up in New Jersey, of all places, in Princeton, in a place where there were more international students from Turkey in the graduate school than there were Latinos in the graduate school. And so that level of extreme, I guess, isolation made it hard to think about how to continue, how to sort of keep my sense of survival, right? Amidst, something that's already hard, like getting your PhD. So I ended up going to New York and Philadelphia as much as possible. And when I went to New York and Philadelphia for this LA girl, looking around, the sights, the color, the smell, the idea of Latinidad for me was so different, so radically different there from what it looked like in LA, that I started really thinking about, what is it that unites us? Like, what is this? Like, how can this whole different texture also be the same thing? And then academically, one is, as a scholar, I have a real commitment to writing things that will help, understand the Latino condition better. So I knew early on that I was going to write on Latinos, but I didn't know what. And looking in history, this sort of thinking about Latinos as so varied hadn't really been tackled, not by historical scholars, not by cultural studies scholars. It hadn't been in the literature. But as I dug through and I started looking at like histories of American politics in the 1960s, for example, I found a really interesting story. So if you look at America in the 1960s, like let's say 1965, you would see that Latinos lived in very different social and political worlds. In the Southwest, you had Mexicans and Mexican Americans and Chicano groups sort of lobbying about poverty and starting to argue that the government pay attention to their communities. In the Northeast, you had Puerto Ricans lobbying to their state governors, to mayors, to pay attention to the fact that, Spanish Harlem and other Boricua neighborhoods had less than adequate schools, no attention, and not even the idea of bilingual education. And Cubans in Miami were really just focused on Cuba, right? Their attention was South. And so, there was no sort of congresses, no conferences that brought these groups together. There was no media platform that brought them together. In fact, they were just so separate, and early attempts to bring them together crumbled very quickly, with Puerto Ricans accusing Mexicans of trying to co-opt them, and with both groups saying Cubans are a different race, they're a different breed. I mean, there were actual statements of this. But that was in the late 1960s. By 1980, 1985, just 25 years later, You had the rise of a national network television, Univision, Telemundo, that connected audiences from, north to south, east to west, and made this idea of like a Hispanic consumer base. You had a new census category. It was called Hispanic, right? That saw all these groups as part of this umbrella category. And the third thing you had is you had the rise of national political platforms, like it's now Unidos Us, but it was NCLR before, like the National Hispanic Leadership Agenda. You had a group that started to lobby the federal government to say, pay attention to us. We're not just these regionalized separate factions. We are a community. And so for me, that was an academic puzzle. This is a historical puzzle, sociological puzzle. Like, how did this shift occur? And because there are very few Latinos in the academy, in fact, today, Latinas still represent less than 2% of tenured professors across America. No one had really written on this. And so it became a mystery to me. And that's the best kind of academic projects, where you're impassioned by it and you feel a connection that if I can sort of uncover this, if I can go to the archives, do the interviews, look up look up the media, things like that, we can cover the pieces of what happened in this, historical transformation. And that's what I ended up doing. And sort of the book lays it all out. But I think one of the biggest pieces for me that was so interesting that I would not have foretold before is the way that all these pieces of media, the census, and politics worked together. So for example, when these groups sort of started figuring out that if they could lobby the Johnson administration, so this is in the late 60s, early 70s, they had to go to Johnson and say, so when Chicanos went to Johnson in the late 60s and said, we need bilingual education, we need more funding for our schools, we are in segregated, you guys are keeping us in separate, segregated Mexican schools, this is unfair. People in Johnson's administration thought they were Puerto Ricans. They'd never met Mexicans. They kept getting this over and over, right? And Puerto Ricans were doing the same thing. They'd go to Johnson, or they'd go to, entities in there, and they would say, well, you guys are just you guys are a regional problem. Go tell your governors this. The federal government looks at federal groups. And so very quickly they realized that if they join together across these ways, they can start making demands upon a national minority basis. And at that time, the Cuban communities began to be more established and realized that they could use things like bilingual education, social services for their community, Spanish language job training program. And so very quickly, what began out of a real political need for government attention and necessity started to evolve. And as they evolved, they started to work with one another. So the first thing that they did was, okay, we can call ourselves that, but nobody's going to believe that we're a group, right? So they'd go to the Census Bureau and they say, and at the time, the Census Bureau never distinguished Latino data from that of whites. So for example, the Census Bureau would always publish things like report on poverty in the US. And when that report came out, all the data was about whites and blacks. And Latino data was almost always mixed in with that of whites, regardless of what you might have thought of, right? That was just the Census Bureau method, their MO. Unless they could definitively say that you were Native American or that you were Black, large swaths of communities were just siphoned away. And so the first thing they realized is we've got to demand our own data. And so they started sitting on boards, right? They started lobbying, they started protesting, and the Census Bureau created its first racial advisory group, and that was for Latinos. And as they started going, they started noticing, okay, even if we get this category, people still have to think about themselves like that. And oftentimes they don't. They might just think of themselves as Mexicans or Cubans or Puerto Rico. Like, how do we do this? And so they started bringing in people from the media, especially people from Univision, what was then called Spanish International Network, right? And bringing them, and Spanish International Network started to do things like run commercials and say, on the census, we're Latino. In fact, one of my favorite stories is they ran a day-long telethon when this new category was going to be. It was in the 1980 census. Univision ran a day-long telethon where they had mariachis, they had salsa bands, they had, folks from South America, things like that. And at each commercial break, they would hold up the new census form with a big circle, and it says, if you're watching this, you're Hispanic. Vote, cross out Hispanic on the next one. And so in all these ways, it took like a cultural campaign. It took like real political necessity. And it took basically the state willing to budge in order for these things to happen. And for me, it was a fascinating story, not just academically, but more a story like our story needs to be told. We need to have this out, because or else people are going to think two things. They're going to think that somehow the government just made it and thus it's false and just constructed and imposed, or they're going to think the opposite, that everybody loves each other and, is exactly the same way and just all, knows each other. And none of those give justice really to the struggle for recognition and how much work it takes to actually be recognized and fight against a lot of the trends we see today. Yeah.
Great. So, Doctor, you talk a little bit just great for my next question, which was about the pros and cons, right? About the label of Hispanics. So you talk about the great things about it and how it united us, but what has been the drawback, right? And the challenges in creating this umbrella where all Latinos fall under the Latino Hispanic label?
Yeah, I think we all know those. And the challenge is the dangers of homogenization. In two ways. One is everybody's the same. So there's this artificialness of what is Latinidad, right? There's this, if you just average, the basic characteristics across groups, what you're going to do is you're going to have this sort of false depiction, right? One way to think about it is Jorge Ramos, for example, who we might all know at Univision, has for years had to learn how to train his Spanish language accent. Right? One of the first things Univision did when they started sort of becoming a national network was create a Spanish grammar almost dictionary and language guide, where they would cross out words that they didn't think would be understood, like chamarra for jacket, or things that were very specific to certain countries. So he had to learn how to cross out those words. And then he had to learn how to create an accent for his Spanish that is actually not found in any Latin American country, right? It's what they call the Walter Cronkite Spanish. He had to learn how to do it so that his Spanish could be reflected, and could be more or less understood across from Puerto Ricans to Dominicans to Mexicans and things like that. So while admirable and it does its purpose, right, it's actually not real. Like it's sort of artificial, which is in some ways when we think of like, there's just this generic stock picture of a brownish skin family with brown eyes and dark hair. And we say that's all Latinos or something like that. So that's his danger. The first danger is just homogenization. And the second danger is that you're going to use a group and use that group to represent all Latinos, as if, the way the media in many ways have just been sort of honing in on Cubans in Miami and saying this is all Latinos, or when everything is just a mariachi, right? And that's supposed to be all of Latinidad music, right? And so those are the difficulties, right? You get lots of inequalities there. One really important inequality is the lack of Afro-Latino representation in Spanish language media or in all other places, right? And so we have to grapple with how to then sort of incorporate diversity, amidst sort of this unifying method, right? And I think folks have done a much better job, but there's always more to do. In fact, a large part has been to sort of push back, and we see this more against the youth, to push back against gender binaries now, right? And to really think about Latinidad as also incorporating sexuality difference, right? And sort of the youth in this way. And so I think that's important in these ways. And that to me doesn't have one answer and is not just one conversation. You've got one of America's most, if not the most dynamic group in America. Every year, a quarter to 30% of us are coming from a different country and a different generation with different understandings. We are getting and rejuvenating in all these different ways, and we're growing. Why would our conversations about who we are, what we should call ourselves, why should those conversations stop growing? Amid so much newness and new ideas, we have a real opportunity to keep having these types of conversations and keep sort of open and sort of amenable to, redoing some parts of our picture, redoing some parts of our narrative, to better incorporate just how dynamic we also are.
Perfect. So this is a great segue for the next question about Latinx, right? So what is your personal take on that term, right? I know there has been a lot of pushback about Hispanics in the past, right? People not wanting to be under the same umbrella because of fear of losing their identity. But what about now with this evolution of the creation of Latinx? What is your take on that?
Yeah, so let me start with the sense that I know people are very passionate about this. They're passionate about it in college campuses, in academia, in corporate boardrooms. Let me tell you with what I know. Here at UC Berkeley, I run something called the Institute of Governmental Studies, where we oversee the California Field Poll. It's a regular field poll of basically California registered voters. And I ran a question, given that there was very little data on this, we ran a question in January and asked folks, anyone that sort of indicated that they were Latino, do you ever use the term Latinx? Now, I know that marketers, and there's a Pew study that exists that suggests that, it's only like 2% of the population or 3% that ever uses that. How did they get that estimate? They got that estimate by creating a question that says, do you consider yourself Hispanic or, and so there were a few boxes, check the box Hispanic or check the box Latino or check the box Latinx, right? And so basically all your labels were mutually exclusive. We did it differently. We just asked folks, do you use the term Latinx? Very often, sometimes. So we wanted to know frequency. And the reason we did that is because from my research, I know that Latinos use different terms for themselves. Sometimes I want to be Chicana, sometimes I want to be Mexican, sometimes I want to be Latina, and hell, sometimes I need to just say I'm Hispanic, even though that's not my preference, but sometimes I just do it, right? It might be because I'm talking to the chancellor, or it might be because, that's what is used or whatever. Sometimes I want to say that, right? And this came from a position that Latinos are dynamic, right? It's not either or all the time. We've learned how to use this, right? And from my own experience as a college professor with perhaps one of the most liberal schools in the country, to that end, even though, our Latino students are vastly underrepresented at UC Berkeley, they're still there and they have their youthful ideas and their political agendas and things like that. And I saw them sort of using Latinx with frequency. And so we ran this and we found that 25% of Californians, 25, that's 1 out of 4, use Latinx either regularly or very often. And I was kind of shocked by that. But then I also saw that these people will also say, because then we asked, how often do you use Latino and how often do you use Hispanic, right? And we saw that those that use Latinx also use Latino a whole lot of times. So, we're developing this paper and it'll be out soon. But the argument there for me is Latinos aren't simpletons. Like, we can collect labels. We know our audience, we know when we're around just Mexicans, or we know our audiences. And so in many ways, the folks that are using Latinx aren't using it at all as a substitute for Latino and Hispanic. They're using it in addition to. And we also found that it's very much the millennial and the Generation Z, especially population, and those that are much more politically progressive. And so, however, even if you look at the Generation Z, some of the more moderate or middle of the road, those that would say that that's their ideology, are more likely to use Latinx than like a baby boomer, really progressive, right? And so I think it's a generational thing, it's a politics thing, but I think most important, it shows us that Latinos are adaptable, they're using different labels as well. I think the question is, what does Latinx even mean? And I think there's a lot of debate, but I think there's a lot of debate about what Latino means and what Hispanic means, and that these things are not just sort of very specific to these populations. If I could guess, what my guess would be, um, that those that, those that call themselves Latinx are largely doing it in social media, in their peer groups, on college campuses. Although we did find that it's not necessarily just the educated, those with just high school education are also using Latinx. So it's a real generational thing. But they might be using Latino just around their family, or in different, or maybe in their workspace or things like that. So I think this sense that it's going to take over, it's a new normal, I think that overlooks the idea that, we're already used to using a bunch of labels, and, it hasn't destabilized who we are. It hasn't threatened our identity. Latinos are still here. Even when we went from, Spanish origin to Hispanic, people freaked out that, what was going on. And then we went Hispanic, Latino, and now we all know that we can go comfortably through a set of labels, and and it doesn't threaten this idea that Latinidad is not real, I think.
Great, great. So I wanted to make sure we have time to open it up to our audience to talk about how they themselves identify. Self-identification has been something that I personally, right, have struggled as well. So when I first arrived to the US many, many years ago, when I was the first time, I was 14, 15 years old, I came from the Dominican Republic. It was the first time that I felt, right, different, right? I was an immigrant, but through high school, I think it was the first. To my surprise, I was the only Latina in the entire high school. But when I went to college, that's when I really embraced the Latino title or label, like you were referring to, Dr. Mora. And I embraced that label. And I have to tell you that very, very few times in my life, I have called myself Hispanic or Dominican American. I'm very passionate about being Dominican, but when somebody asks me, where are you? I say Latina. And then I say Dominican, right? Very rarely I use the term Hispanic. So I'm very curious to know from our members in the audience today, how you yourself identify, and do you struggle by being labeled, by being boxed into these new terms? Recently, we also have heard about this new term, or not new term. It's been around for a long time, but uh, the Latinx, but also Afro Latino, right? So now there has been a sub levels of titles, I call it labels. What are you? Some of you would like to share with us. What are your thoughts on that?